Welcome to the Quantum City Initiative, a show about the most important stories, ideas at the intersection of AI, cities, real estate, and the leaders shaping the future of how and where we live and work. Do you save and reinvigorate cities, or are you building new ones?
What is most critical for cities in the future with this sort of AI factory race to work? Okay, episode 26, the QCI show. Super excited today just because it's just me. My co-host Chase couldn't make it, unfortunately. So we do expect this to be the highest viewed show because you have the real talent here. No, I'm kidding. We have an amazing guest today, Daniel English from Legacy Investing. Daniel, how are you today?
I'm wonderful. Excited to
Awesome.
be here talking about data centers.
Love that. So listen, let's give a little bit of a backstory. Daniel and I met. He was kind enough to speak on a panel at our Strata conference in the fall. Shout out to that conference. And we will be hosting Strata 2.0 this fall. Be on the lookout for that. And we had a wonderful panel. And what the real focus of that panel was around sort of city retrofits and legacy infrastructure. And sort of what happens if, and all that, the news about, there's just a lot of 30% of, offices are obsolete and then there's a $1.1 trillion of office space at risk. So what do you do with that? Do you put it into residential? Do you update it to sort of class A plus? Do you put it into data centers? Sort of that's what we're here to talk about today, which was awesome. But Daniel, before I botch your introduction, why don't you introduce yourself? And then we'll get started on a couple of news stories. And then sort of the meat of the show, talking about Chicago, some of the data centers, and really what you guys are working on.
Yeah, wonderful. Greg, the topic's very exciting to me. Obviously, we'll talk about this. We're making some of those changes now in urban cores and more broadly. So my background was in tech startups. So I did tech startups for about a decade, took one of them public, and then ultimately focused on infrastructure. And that was about 15 years ago. And the idea was all these tech startups are going to need a foundation with which to run. And so let's own and invest in the underlying foundation as opposed to the individual startup that they all need. And that obviously proved correct. And today, we're really building out the foundation of AI. And that is so incredibly exciting to me because everything, this very podcast is happening in a data center right now. And I think a lot of folks I talk to are not necessarily aware of the impact that their lives are having with technology or that there is a building or a set of buildings, many buildings that are housing everything that we're doing in our lives now. And so I'm excited to build that. So that company I started 15 years ago with a co-founder from my tech days, Jay Rappaport. And then our leadership team is made up of very seasoned data center tech executives. So our CTO, Manny, has been building data centers for over 30 years and with us since the very early days. And we have a whole team of experts on this. And at this point, we also do own and invest in large scale e-commerce warehouses. But I think the topic that's more exciting to everybody is, of course, data centers. At this point, we've done everything from converted old enterprise data centers into cloud and colo. We've built ground up data centers. We've done turnkey AI inference within our buildings. We have all the big names that you read about in the headlines right now. So very seasoned in the space. And I think I believe we have a slightly different perspective on the future of data centers and feel like there's a unique opportunity right now to change the narrative on what data centers look like. We're all going to have to live with them. So let's make them beautiful and desirable.
I love that. So let's talk. So I guess, what is a data center, Daniel? A lot of folks sort of years ago are probably thinking of sort of gross old warehouses with just a bunch of computer racks in them. Now we are sort of living this artificial intelligence boom. And there's this constant conversation about this infrastructure investment and the billions, if not trillions of dollars going into data centers. What does that mean?
Yeah.
What is that?
Greg, I actually just wrote a book on this, which will be on Amazon shortly, but it's called Data Centers Are Not Centers. And so a core premise, data centers are really just infrastructure. And this is a good thing for the future of data centers. I think everybody knows right now data centers are generally not liked.
Because they're what? Ugly to look at, and they're in these suburban environments.
The stories I heard, I'm sitting in DC, which of course is the data center capital. And I was with some political folks last night, and the conversation was, by one politician was, I need something to run on, and there's data centers coming. And so people hate data centers, so I'm going to run anti-data centers. And there was somebody else at the dinner that said, I live in farm country and I have this beautiful bucolic views, and now there's an ugly data center. I understand that tension. Data centers are unique. If you look at all of human history, all buildings are designed for people, right? And except for data centers are brand new. Like even the pyramids were designed for people, right? They hold arrow. But what you're sitting in, what I'm sitting in, is designed for us. They're beautiful. We pay more rent because they're beautiful, or we pay a higher purchase price because it's beautiful. We want sunlight. We want airflow. Servers don't care. They don't care if the building's pretty. They don't care if there's sunlight. They don't care if there's a glass facade. And so for years, data centers were built practically as infrastructure, but that means that they are not attractive. They tend to have big barbed wire fences around them. Mm-hmm. They end up being, most people I talk to in Northern Virginia think they're prisons. They don't even know it's a data center. They're just like, what's this ugly ass prison? In our industry for years, we described it a little bit as marketing, meaning security is real. Don't get me wrong, but I want to give you two points. Security is very real. We take it very seriously. We have very large tenants that we take this very seriously for. But there was an understanding that to some degree, when you pull up to a data center, the more it looks like a fortress and a prison cell, the better, because everybody feels safer. That doesn't necessarily mean there's more or less security. It's an appearance, but the communities don't like that. And so a reference point I think about all the time is like, why is one Vanderbilt beautiful and do people love it? But the second you get out into the outskirts of Manhattan and you see all warehouses, do people think it's ugly? One is a beautiful building and one isn't. And so data centers have had this struggle. But if we go back to what is a data center, right? The data center is not the shell. So why is one Vanderbilt pretty? Well, because people go there every day and people want to sit in a beautiful office. It's part of their identity, their corporate experience. They want sunlight, they want good views, they want amenities. Again, servers don't care about that. So a data center is really a building for servers, and servers can be underground, they can be on a rooftop, they can be in space, underwater.
We've talked about that. We've talked about putting them in space. Elon's talking about that. Sure. We'll get to that in a little bit now that you brought that up, but keep going.
But I'm excited about this because that means there's room for creativity. So we have, and I know we'll talk, we have a class mixed-use office tower in downtown Minneapolis. It's a big AI inference site. And that is possible only because of this. And so people that go, it's literally half, we built an AI inference node on top of an office building. And it's beautiful. Nobody knows it's a data center. You wouldn't know if you're driving past it. It's a full building. And it proves out, meets all the security requirements, it meets the operational requirements. And to me, that's exciting because we're going to have to live with data centers. Technology doesn't go backwards. We're not going to have less AI 10 years from now. And so if we have to live with this, can we put it in a way into our cities that we like? And we revitalized what would have otherwise been a vacant downtown building.
All right, so let's talk about that for a second. So we'll hit some quick hit news stories, and this is number one. So phenomenal transition there. Data centers are heading downtown. Okay, that's the headline I want to talk about here. Traditionally, like you said, these data centers, they look like prisons. They're warehouses, and they're sort of off the beaten path, quote unquote. They're in these suburban environments. Yes, Elon Musk is talking about putting them in space. There's talk about putting them in Alaska for the cooling. There's talk about putting them underwater. I'm not a fan of the underwater one. I think we got to save our fishies. But I guess there's a reason for me, my interpretation, you're the expert here, my interpretation of not putting data centers in an urban core environment. One, you need more space. Okay. Two, why pay urban rent, I guess, or urban purchase price to put racks and boxes? So talk to me about the shift. This is what legacy investing, this is what you're talking about. I assume when you said a little bit earlier, your approach to data centers is a little bit different. I assume this is part of your thesis. What is this shift to data centers, moving downtown? Is it because we're running out of the suburban environment? Or do you fundamentally believe that part of, and again, the conversation we had a couple of months ago, is this retrofit of the office, that data centers are the perfect fit for it? And further, if we didn't, let's say, have this obsolete commercial space issue, would data centers be in an urban environment?
All great questions, and something I care deeply about. if we look at, let me frame it this way. If we look out over the next decade, there are some pretty significant growth projections in, let's just stick AI for the moment. So cloud's still growing, enterprise use is still growing.
Yeah.
AI inference is expected to 10x in the next 5 years by some.
Can you just tell me what AI inference is real quick?
Yeah, the simplest way I think about it is when you talk to your favorite LLM, and whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, and it's thinking the answer. When it spits out that answer, that's inference. It's very high-end compute. The counterpoint, which gets talked about, is training. Training historically was when you build the model. There are some ongoing shifts where training and inference sort of end up working more and more together. And so there's some discussion around, will those be, I think there's a perception today that they're very distinct. I don't know that that's the long-term view, but there are, the simple analogy is that we think about all the time is let's take your Amazon. So I don't know if most people are aware of this, but Amazon has giant warehouses in the middle of the country that hold a lot of products. They also, I think lots of people know and don't like that they can see an Amazon warehouse maybe close by in their suburban community. If you want a same day or next day package, that package has to be coming from pretty close by. And that's why there are more urban warehouses. If you can take 2 days, it's okay if it's sitting in Columbus. Data centers actually work the same way. So increasingly, I don't know about you, my LLM takes way too long to respond. The things we're doing right now are very real time, and to think Waymos and self-driving cars and other applications that are very latency sensitive, you do care about how far the digital package has to travel.
Okay.
And the digital package is traveling not just to the people in the town. There's that, but it's also traveling across the country. So same as logistics. So an easy way to think about data centers is that data centers work like logistics. They're just digital packages instead of physical ones. And so you can have some combination of West Texas, large campus, and more urban core. And you're going to start to see more of that, just like you did in warehousing. So our core belief is that, again, if you look at the future and you look at what is happening, AI inference in particular, so that brain power that we're all using in our bots, that is going to 10x. So it's some of the estimates are 2 gigawatts of compute today, going up to say 20 gigawatts over the next 5 years.
Okay.
Well, the sort of training bucket of that, where you're training the model, is expected to grow just as much. Cloud is also still growing, so is enterprise. And then I've seen way more dramatic estimates too. But let's just say we're going to 10x. Right. We're going to have a lot more data sets. And where are they going to go? Because it works like warehouses. And I think my perception is that there were people sort of getting used to all these Amazon warehouses rolling out over the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. You're seeing the same phenomenon in my experience in data centers. Data centers are rolling out. We're going to have to live with them. We all want our same day packages. Even more, we all want to use our bots and our favorite Zoom meeting and our, really, I want to make one point early on that I think frames all this. Data centers are actually civic institutions.
Okay.
And they are cultural institutions. And that doesn't necessarily make sense at first, but if you think about it, all of the photos of your loved ones live in a data center. Your text messages to your partner, your children, your grandparents, right? That all lives in the data center. All those iMessages. This experience lives in the data center. All of our cultural communications, all the digital art that we have, all the digital archive that we have of our culture, of society, lives in a data center. And so these are very important buildings. You can't just get rid of them.
So you were just talking about politicians having something to run on. Daniel, you're going to bring me to tears here. There's the message right there. The data centers are core to our life. Okay, so I got a question to sort of build on that. The closer I am to one of these data centers, the faster. Claude Cowork, which took, I was running, I guess, a series of complex tasks and projects yesterday. It just took too long, man. I was getting impatient. So the closer I am in proximity to these data centers, the faster my response time will be, the more intelligence my sort of inference will be. Will we see companies migrate closer to data centers to achieve that level of speed Or will we see those large companies, and I think I already know the answer here, will we see the large companies basically just have their own data centers in their own buildings? Or will we just have so many quote unquote data centers that we won't even talk about data centers, because in every core building that we have, there will be an element of a quote unquote data center that is powering this inference or training for everybody around them.
I do want to be careful that I don't miscommunicate the latency part. If we go back in history, data, and this will get to this sort of urban story. Data centers lived in office buildings. So a lot of office buildings had a basement data center, right? And it was like, 500 kilowatts a megawatt. And that was a thing. And so there was this concept for many years. It was talked about on panels for the last decade, which is we're going to have edge data centers, we've got little data center nodes everywhere. You're going to put them in basements of buildings. And that phenomenon did not happen. Instead, the reason why there's a political reaction is there are giant campuses, right, being built that we see, and there are big data centers that we see. And there's just, I think at the highest level, there is just a lot of compute that we're all going to want and need, right? Something I think about all the time. I fly in a lot of airplanes. Just getting on an airplane requires huge amounts of compute and data center need, because your tickets in a data center, your check-ins in a data center, the plane's flight logs in a data center, all of that, right? So we're going to need a lot of compute. So where do you put it? You have to put it somewhere. Latency matters, but latency is based on digital packages to humans across the country. So let's take Minneapolis. We have an AI data center in downtown Minneapolis. Minneapolis has a great latency profile for the entire US. So it's not just serving people in Minneapolis, it is serving people across the US. And that's how logistics works. But I think, just to keep it simple, at the end of the day, data centers are migrating to basically NFL cities. So if you're in an NFL city, you will have data centers. You will have a lot of them. We're not going to see less of them. And so the question is, how do we start to incorporate this? Or the question I ask all the time is, how do we incorporate this into our cities in a way that people are not miserable? If I lived in Ashburn, I'd probably feel somewhat miserable. Like they're not attractive buildings today. And it changed the perception of just driving through those neighborhoods that used to be there. And I believe there are ways, as we continue to add these, that we can do it in a way that is interesting for communities, respects the fact that these are cultural institutions and civic buildings that we have to live with. And so there, I guess maybe a question you asked a little bit earlier is, are there going to continue big ones? Why is it moving downtown? It's moving downtown in part because there are benefits to being downtown. You want to be on the fiber on-ramps to get that low latency profile. Downtown urban cores have that. You want to be near infrastructure. So urban cores have a lot of infrastructure. I love going to cities like Rome and Milan, where you see new cities built on top of old cities, right? Those were, we talked about this when we were at MIT. Cities are going to continue to evolve. Old office buildings are going to get reinvented into new assets. That's going to continue to happen, and there are benefits for data centers doing that, both because of latency profiles, because you can now fit a large amount of compute in an office building, which you couldn't do 10 years ago. So that's a benefit. There's good labor, there's good infrastructure. There's a lot of benefits to being downtown. And frankly, there's a lot of political pushback, understandably, for areas that, are beautiful farmland or whatnot, and communities don't want them.
Let's talk about infrastructure, and let's go to absolute root infrastructure. Let's talk about power for a bit. So the conversation, we talk about quantum cities, and we sort of rank them on a handful of things. And again, the conversation we had at MIT, we talked a lot about sort of red tape, political red tape, the inability to build. And then one of the things that we're seeing now is the grid and power. And what happens if we build all these data centers? There's a lot of stories out there, not just that data centers are ugly, but they pollute water, they take up all the power. I'm not saying these are correct, but I'm just sort of outlining narratives. And, one of them in particular is that our grid cannot support simply enough power. So you talk to me about that. Can these cities, and let's talk about Chicago, and let's sort of move to one of the most recent projects that you've been talking about at 4 and South LaSalle that you guys have been working on. But just in general, you walk me through, infrastructure really at the grid level, and as a society, as a city. And the reason why, what you said, NFL cities are those the ones that sort of have that root level power infrastructure to be able to build these data centers or maintain them?
These are hard, sticky problems. And I tend to be an optimist on this, and I'm excited about the opportunities for this. It is the first time in human history we're dealing with this, and really at this scale. And that's really interesting to me. Again, if you say, so I can contextualize my answers, all of human history, buildings were meant for people, and now buildings are meant for machines, or this type of building is meant for a machine. You never had this before. You've had great technology rollouts in human history before, right? You've had railroads roll out, you've had manufacturing roll out. Again, those buildings still generally held humans. The idea that you have a giant multi-billion-dollar machine that is running on the countryside, holding all of our digital archive of our memories, right? Is a fascinating sci-fi sounding new phenomenon. And as a culture, we're adapting to that. As developers and investors, we're adapting to that. And there are not, I can tell you, as an industry, we do not yet have consensus on how we solve that. Those are very hard problems. And so something I'm interested in is looking back at history, at other technology cycles, other cycles that have happened, and what can we learn from them as we think about it. You know, I have a book on my bookshelf about an architect in the 1930s who was going around saying we were all going to be living in artificial environments, and he was generally fired from every one of his jobs. Today, we all live in artificial environments, right? We all have air conditioning, we all have lighting, we all have this. If you take that in the grid, right? And the reason why that was avant-garde was because you hadn't invented some of that yet, and you started to have the grid, obviously. Like it was like, I think it was 1935 in the US in general, everybody had a light bulb, which to me is much later than I would have realized, but you know, the whole country. And if you think about it, the grid is only 100 years old, and it was sort of built all at once. So first cities had to even adapt to this. And that's really interesting to me. There was a point where cities had to figure out, where's the substation going to go? Where's the power plant going to go? There are amazing photos of New York City when the grid first started rolling out with wires everywhere, because you had streetcars, you had private utilities for streetcars. You had the whole world in which we live now, where like power is sort of a granted, something that we just presume. You just plug something in, power comes on. That's a very recent modern phenomenon. Yeah. Not at all how it started. And I give that context because when we have to answer, what are we going to do going forward? There's all this new power. I am intrigued by the fact that that is sort of based on the concept that the grid has always been, you just plug in, you just get power. That's how the world works. That is a new thing. As a society, we already had to deal with this before. We're going to have to deal with it again. Technology moves forward. It doesn't go backwards. And what's also fascinating and hard is it's not linear. Like, how many buildings do you need? That depends on how many people live in the town or are moving to the town. How many data centers do you need? That's not a linear, predictable pattern. It's how many of us are Zooming, clouding, whatever. That is astronomical, nonlinear growth that we have to deal with. And that's why I keep emphasizing, we can't just, if we say we don't want data centers, or we don't like data centers, or we don't like power plants, what are we going to do? At some point in the 1920s and 30s, we were also dealing with this, right? We were like, how do we deal with our streetcars? How do we deal with our homes? Like, people wanted appliances for the first time. So these are, what comforts me a little bit is these are all problems we've had to face before. The grid is old, right? I mean, there's a lot of aging infrastructure. There's a lot of upgrades needed. I saw a headline, I think it was this morning, that was like in the Wall Street Journal, that was talking about the need for, how are Americans going to pay for all these grid upgrades that are all data center driven? It's a great headline.
It's a phenomenal headline.
But I think it hides the fact that the grid is 100 years old, that there's a lot of aging infrastructure, that as a society, independent of data centers, we're consuming more electrical power. Think about everybody with a Tesla or an electric car that they're plugging in. That's going into the grid. I don't know about you. Everything in my home is plugged in now. Now,
I mean, and to ground people back to reality, and we take advantage of this. So listen to this. So we were just talking before we kicked off the show about the weather here in the Northeast. So I'm just south of Boston. Okay. So you talk about the grid. Every single day I wake up, I have incredibly fast internet, and my power is there. We got 3 feet of snow dumped on us. Okay. And we lost power for a week. Now, thank God that, we have a generator. I got 3 little kids and we have a generator. And so we were able to power our home. Had a lot of friends and families that did not have that. We lost power for a week because of 3 feet of snow. So to your point, am I okay with an upgrade to the grid? Sure, data centers might be, I guess, the catalyst to provide those upgrades faster, right? Because now we're using a little bit more power than we might have anticipated. But those upgrades need to happen anyways, because we take for granted as a society, to your point, power and our power needs. And when it goes out for a week at a time, I'm ready to make the upgrades.
I feel that it's the same thing of when the airplane is, we don't have Wi-Fi on this particular flight and I'm lost. I'm like, I can't do it. I'm helpless. So it is interesting. Technology is an amazing thing in that once we get used to it, we sort of presume it's always been there and that
Right.
we get it and it just comes.
And I'm entitled to it and I'm used to it and I take it for granted.
And so I think that context is important to being able to understand the broader conversation and the context of understanding that we have not always been here, that there are multiple versions of utilities over the last 100 years. And as a society, I sort of, because I don't know how you move forward if you don't accept that these are real problems that we're going to have to deal with. And it's because you can't shoo it away or protest it away, you have to deal with it. And so it's better to solve a problem for it. And so the good news is there are things we can be doing, and there are a lot of people in our industry thinking about it. So let me take our project in Chicago. We've done the same thing in Minneapolis. We have taken multiple existing assets in downtown urban cores. So in Chicago, it's a CBOE headquarters. For context, that building's been vacant for 4 years. Nobody's using it. Like rats running around inside. Or were. Not anymore. But, it's a vacant urban core building, but it had electrical infrastructure and grid infrastructure that had already been built out. And so we're able to take advantage of that. We have multiple projects around the country happening right now that are simply using existing grid infrastructure that's already been built, but is not being used. Just like they're it's like taking any vacant asset, vacant infrastructure, and sort of simply putting it back to use and reinvesting in it. There is still a lot of opportunity to do that around the country. So we're doing it in Texas right now. We're doing it in Illinois. We're doing it in we're doing it in Virginia. And so I think there is an opportunity to use existing infrastructure. Although the narrative I read in the press tends to be about, we're doing all these power upgrades. And look, that we're going to somehow, as a society, have to figure out how to add more power plants. That is a reality. And data centers, we're all using them as our digital archive and our, whatnot. So it is a sticky problem. This is not an easy problem with a clear solution. It's not like some corporate overlord is sort of, trying to build out something that's screwing us. We all want these. We all use them. I've always struggled with, you can't get a next day package or a same day package from Amazon if they don't have something nearby.
Oh, and by the way, when I go to Amazon right now and I don't see that I'm going to get it tomorrow, I have zero interest. That's how spoiled we are.
It is. And so I guess maybe to try and answer some of your questions, our view, and I would say the markets, the industry consensus, as I understand it at the moment, is that these are hard problems. We're all trying to put creative thought into solving the problems, but there is existing grid infrastructure that you can tap into and you can take advantage of it. And so we're doing that in multiple urban cores. And so I think this is a very good thing. For instance, in the CBOE headquarter building, we are taking an asset that has been vacant for 4 years, that very publicly was last sold to the gentleman that we partnered with for $12 million. One argument is it's sort of a dead asset, right?
Which, by the way, you could argue is not attractive if there are rats running around. It's not a pretty building to look at either way in the middle of Chicago.
But now that building we are investing heavily in that building. We are bringing back jobs. We're revitalizing the building. We're revitalizing the streetscape on that building. There are no vermin running around anymore. Like, it's a good building now. And it's a building that is famous in the city of Chicago, that I think is due its respect for its history in the city of Chicago. And I love the idea that we're taking an asset that really helped launch electronic trading, and we're now bringing back sort of that, bringing the next generation to it, right? That to me is such a romantic idea that we're taking and reinventing an iconic piece of architecture in downtown Chicago, and we're bringing it into the next generation in a way that's good for the city, that's using existing infrastructure, that's improving the taxes, that's improving the investment in the loop, and that is bringing back jobs. That to me is a very positive story on data centers, and it's meeting all of our desires to use more compute.
So let's talk about that building, but I guess as a primer to that, you talk about, you mentioned One Vandy, right? One Vanderbilt, gorgeous building, in Manhattan, designed for people. Okay. And then you talk about data centers. They are buildings designed for robots, computers. What does that mix look like? And is that how you're thinking about specifically this building, where you are designing a building for both? Or am I misreading this? Because that's where my mind is going as you're talking about these assets and these retrofits, and your approach is that it's not one or, it's both now.
It's, when I frame it, so servers just have slightly different concerns than human, obviously. There's a wonderful book that I love called Form Follows Finance that studies the skyscrapers of Chicago and New York City in like the 30s. And it was well understood in the 20s and 30s that if you made the floor plates too far away from the window, how quickly rents would drop. And they knew how much sunlight, like there were basic calculations of how much sunlight could get how far into a room based on the window size in December versus August in these cities, because nobody would rent an office space. Because again, people were not using indoor lighting and air conditioning at that point when these buildings were being built. And yes, there were light bulbs, but they were too hot. So you didn't use them for that, right? They were not sitting in environments you and I are right now. And buildings were built in a particular way. And I emphasize that to be humans respond. This is why office buildings are not regularly converted to apartment buildings, right? Why is the dead office stock not all becoming apartment buildings? It's because as electric lighting came out, floor plates got deeper, and you now are putting humans in the middle of a 50,000 square foot floor plate, and nobody wants to live in that, right? Because it's now dark. Servers don't care, and that's why you can put servers in the middle of a 50,000 square foot floor plate. So you can use assets that were designed for humans, and you just get more flexibility with the servers in the basement. You can put the generators in the middle of the floor. Because the infrastructure doesn't care, it just gives you more creativity and flexibility. That's what's exciting to me, because it gives you freedom to reinvent buildings that may not otherwise. I don't mean to say there are not humans in these buildings. We do create jobs. We do bring humans in, and you do care about that. But you can take advantage of buildings that otherwise are not human friendly because the servers don't care.
Where my mind was going is, because that is a constant conversation about what do you do with these retrofits? That was the topic of our panel, and there are some folks that are having success with the residential play, but yeah, nobody wants the apartment or condo in the middle of the floor plate with no windows or anything like that. So I understand that flexibility. One of the things you're talking about, and I've had this question, and I didn't want to throw it in the way my brain works here, but you were talking about meeting with some folks. You're just outside DC, okay, and somebody running on anti-data centers, because that sounds fun. And I hate this type of question because it's too vague, but I'm going to ask you anyways. What is Washington's role in all of this? And is there a role in all of this when you talk about infrastructure upgrades, when you talk about, I guess, the press and the PR of data centers and the infrastructure build? This has got to be a topic of conversation. You're in Arlington for a reason, my guess. You're out with some politicians and some folks last night. What are their thoughts, and what is their role? And why would you run anti-data center? We'll save that one, but please.
Yes, I think there is a big policy. Frankly, there is a need for all of us to work together. And in fact, and I will say, I'm curious, Georgetown University and I are doing a roundtable discussion on just the topic of water in a few weeks, just because How do you think about water? And that perspective needs to bring together utilities, politicians, technologists, right? Because these problems these are hard problems, right? They're not going to be solved with a simple statement of we don't want data centers. We're gonna, we know that's not how the world actually works. And so we need to, and it's not a simple legislation change, and it's not a simple developer shift. It is a tricky question that requires us to come together. And so there are a lot of conversations going on. I think, there's an intersection of zoning, right? Something that's interesting is data centers didn't really exist 25 years ago. And so if you say, was there zoning code for data center? Not historically. Right. And then frankly, the question of what is it? If you can put a data center in an office building, is it a data center? What does that actually mean? Right. So I think there's still, on one dimension, there's a question of what is a data center and how do we think about what that is. I'm part of the ULI Data Center Council, and we put out a white paper on just trying to define for communities what's a data center and how do you even think about zoning? How do you think about what they look like? Because I think as these are propagating, they're no longer just a one-off. They are in urban cores, they're in communities where we have to live with them, we have to see them. And there is not an organic mechanism with which to build a prettier data center because you get higher rents. One Vanderbilt gets astronomical rents, that's well known. Right. And it's because it's beautiful. There is no incentive. Servers don't really pay higher rents because of a beautiful building. So you have to have other mechanisms to incentivize that, right? So we at Legacy, my company, we think deeply about this because we care, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it helps if there's an incentive to build a pretty building, to revitalize the landscape, and we've already proven you can do mixed use. They don't have to be closed off from the community.
Yeah.
They don't have to be these isolated sort of prison-esque assets that nobody wants to go to. You can do it differently. We would like to work with politicians ourselves to help work through that. And we are working with the cities that we're talking to. I think there is a need to partner with the cities and to bring creative ideas around how to do this in a way that is different. It's still so new. I'm excited to showcase what we have done in other cities because we've shown that you can do this. Your tenants can be happy, and not only happy, excited, because they're also participating in that, right? The city can be excited. And so I think there are other models to consider. It's just, again, this is also new, and these are tricky problems, but there is a political element for sure, because these are civic institutions. They interact with communities. There are tool books or tool sets and playbooks that we have in other asset classes that we can bring to bear.
So when you're looking at cities to invest in projects, right? We talked about Minneapolis, we talked about Chicago. I think you mentioned Texas, California, Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky. You have projects going on. What do you look at in a specific market? Is it in the incentives? When looking at a specific city, is it participation with local government, or are you just looking at the actual asset and the infrastructure of that asset, or a combination of the two?
And let me broaden the answer to, it's not just we, but it's we and our tenants, right? The companies that want to be in this building. It is a mix of a variety of things, because I will tell you, I get phone calls all the time from people being like, I've got this great piece of land in this place, and I won't name any cities so I don't offend anybody, but we're like, that'll never be a data center, and they're like, but I have power, and I'm like, yeah, but it'll never be a data center, and so there are
just real quick, why are you? I'm just curious what went on in your head where you were like, nope.
There's a couple things. I suppose it's like, I will go back to my One Vanderbilt office building analogy. Why doesn't One Vanderbilt exist anywhere else? Frankly, if you built that in downtown Nashville, I don't know if there's enough people that would need.
Yeah.
So to some degree, I don't mean to say data centers are, because they are different and they are designed for servers, does not mean that they are location agnostic. They just have different location parameters than humans.
Yeah.
I want to live close to the coffee shop, the gym, my kid's school, etc. Right? That's, as a human, that's what the types of things we solve to. As a server, they solve to can I get my digital packages across the country quickly?
Mhm.
Which is different, but that they're still location important. And fiber, which is how you move those digital packages, is infrastructure that is, buried in the ground and not moving. And so location matters. So if you pick a location that does not have access to fiber and other infrastructure, you can't put a data center there, right? Or it's very hard to put a data center there. You also care about things like labor. People still work at data centers, still build data centers. So labor is still important. So it's a combination of core infrastructure to move the digital packages, labor, access to power. Power costs do matter, right? Some states you're at like 5 cents, some states you're at almost 20 cents. That's a meaningful cost difference. There is an interest in what the type of power that you're receiving is. Hillsboro, Oregon, where we have data centers and is a great data center market, has a lot of renewable power, and that's very desirable, right? So there is a mix of what is their power, what is the source of the power. There's a mix of infrastructure to both obtain the power and the fiber and the water infrastructure. Those all matter. But so that's sort of tier one. But then let's presume there's 2 places that both have that. Then things like incentives start to matter. Can you partner with the community? Can you have a positive impact? Can you partner with the local politicians around ways to create incentives? I think that does change where people want to go, and people are making choices based on, I would say, investors, developers, and tenants are making decisions based on some of those other dynamics.
What are the most attractive or hottest markets right now? And are there any surprises that some of our viewers might be like, hadn't thought of that one?
I think it's well understood that Northern Virginia, Atlanta, Dallas, Santa Clara, Chicago, those are big data center markets. If you read any of the public reports or headlines, that. Some that are a little more surprising, like Minneapolis, actually great data center market. San Antonio, Austin. Classically, real estate investors tended to think of those as sort of tertiary or secondary cities from an investment standpoint. They are good data center markets because, like Minneapolis, to most folks I talk to, is not obviously a good data center market, but it's great because of a combination of partnership with the city, access to infrastructure. There's actually a lot of free cooling. It's cold there for a chunk of the earth. That's good. And the fiber is great to get to the rest of the country. And so there are markets like that that are surprising. There's a lot of conversations I hear about, I have power, not near anything. Can I put a data center here? We're not seeing that. I would say data centers tend to cluster the way car dealerships do. And so actually something I give people feedback on all the time is if there's no other car dealerships nearby, you're probably not putting a car dealership there. And so data centers work similarly. And that's because in you reference this, I think at the very beginning, data centers actually talk to each other. And that's part of there's really been 3 shifts in data centers. We're all talking about AI right now, but like when we started investing in data centers, it was just after the invention of cloud. But pre-cloud, data centers were built as fortresses in part because they couldn't go down. If they went down, you were screwed. Once you had cloud and virtualization, which is around 2009, 10, if a data center goes down, another data center could pick it up. You also have more application layer redundancy and then AI, even more dynamics related to all that. And so the point is data centers cluster and for good reason. And so you'll see that.
So we only got a few minutes left. I got a million different questions, but I don't have time for them all. Hopefully I choose the right ones. Before we get to some rapid fire and some fun questions towards the end, which we like to talk about all of our guests, Elon Musk has talked about, or others have talked about, data centers in space and data centers at the bottom of the ocean and data centers just put them in Alaska. It's free. You mentioned free cooling. By the way, I'm going to be in Minneapolis in May. I'll ping you. Maybe I can come by one of your buildings. Is that real? Are we, what is, when people hear data centers in space, is that just Elon Musk being like, he's just pumping one of his many companies, but SpaceX, talking about just,
it sounds like a great way to sell more rocket.
Exactly. That's what I mean. So is that something real? Can we do that? And the conversation you're having about sort of this mixed use in the development, will that become obsolete because we're just going to put everything up above us in space?
I would say I'm not hearing that from the market for the simple reason of how do you maintain servers? Yeah. It's fascinating. I mean, it's great headlines.
That's my point. It's sensational. It's amazing.
It's great from that standpoint. I think on a very practical level, data centers, the servers require, somebody has to go in and touch servers.
Yeah.
All the infrastructure that supports data centers requires regular round the clock support. And so round the clock support doesn't work so well underwater or in space. And so I think at cocktail parties on that, it generally gets sort of laughed about a little bit. It's a good chuckle and it's an interesting idea. I'm not hearing it practically.
Well, it's because you're just not solving the big enough problems. Why don't we just put societies and communities underwater and then back in space? That's what Elon wants to do. No, I'm kidding. I think that's fair. Okay, a couple quick hit questions and then we'll wrap up. Fast forward 12 months. So, I mean, the world is changing. The rate of change, the pace of change is immense right now. Fast forward 12 months in general, we're March 2027. What is one headline that we're going to be reading about, that we're going to be talking about data centers, about commercial real estate, about cities that nobody's talking about today? Can you help predict the future for me?
Given the stuff I'm working on, I fully predict the future is going to include headlines around reinvention of urban cores with more data centers. And that is, I don't see that in the press right now. There are things I'm doing that I can't talk about publicly yet that will be in the headlines in the next year that will be meaningful. And that's exciting to me. I think, because again, I think I don't want to discount that these are tricky problems, but I think that there are solutions to them that we can talk about. The other conversation, I hosted a ski trip last week with really the core group of AI users and investors in the space. And so it was a really interesting set of conversations because we were all asking this, like, where do we think the world's going? And one of the conversations that has come up repeatedly is those of us that are in the middle of it understand what's happening. Our perception is that most people still have no idea the scope, the scale, and the power of this. And
I agree.
I think there is still a lot of technology rollout and transformation that's coming that is way beyond sort of a headline around how are we going to upgrade the grid, right? And again, I tend to think that every technology rollout in human history is scary. Even when the cotton gin came out, people were like, oh no, it's job disruption. So it's going to happen. I'm not naive to that. But I think if you said what's going to change, just the scale that we are seeing on the ground and that is getting adopted by society at large on these new technologies is so massive. And I don't think people are necessarily aware yet of the power or the scale or the scope. And that is both exciting and, raises challenges we're going to have to address. But I think you're going to see those kind of headlines.
Love it. We talk about quantum cities. We talk about smart cities a bunch. You're obviously working on powering the majority of those. What's the single most important metric for a healthy city? High level.
Oh man, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, frankly, the conversation we have is really, how do you want a city where people want to live, right? I mean,
vibrancy, walkability, community, people walking around. I mean, Boston still, I do a lot of travel. It's just with a lot of our customers. I very much enjoy going to London. I very much enjoy going to a handful of other cities. There's just much more happening in the afternoons. Boston, my hometown, I'm sorry to say it, walking around downtown, still just a bummer, man. I don't care how smart we are. It's just a bummer. There's not a lot of people walking around. There's a ton of traffic. I know people are going into the city, but I don't know what they're doing when they're there. They're just staying in the box.
Yeah, we need community and affordability, and you need to be able to be there and live there. New York City obviously is having its own set of struggles related to this problem. One final data point, because I know we're about a ton. I think it's Loudoun County gets something like 60% of its revenue. I may be getting this back, or 40%. It's at least 40% of its tax revenue from 6% of its land, and that's because of data centers. And so, frankly, I'm hopeful and optimistic that if we can solve the fact that data centers can be, and we've already proven we can do this, pretty buildings that communities are happy to have, and they can generate that much tax benefit for schools and communities and quality without the prison effect, that is a very good thing for cities. And that's, I would say, that is what gets me up in the morning, is knowing that there is a path. We're not stuck with big, ugly data centers that are hurting communities. We can actually do this in a way that's desirable, good for us, builds these next generation civic institutions, and provides amazing tax revenue.
You're an inspiration, Daniel. Amazing conversation. Oh, real quick, tell us about your book. You mentioned you got a book coming.
It's called Centers Not Centers. It'll be on Amazon shortly, but it's actually an architecture book on how we transformed this office tower in Minneapolis into a mixed-use AI data center, and it sort of breaks down this. It's really an opportunity to think through all of this and with some pretty pictures.
Love it. Okay, it'll be out. Check it out. Daniel English, Legacy Investing, the Quantum City Show, episode 26. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming out.